Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome to the final episode in this series of lectures that we have been together participating in, relating to the counter-narrative on religion and state that Javed Ahmed Ghamidi has put forward back in 2015 with a series of points that he related. His discussion first had gone through, and our discussion up to this point in the many sessions prior has discussed the traditional narrative as Ghamidi has understood it, and then gone into the 10 key points that frame the counter-narrative that Javed Ghamidi has proposed. And it would be lovely to spend this session summarizing all that up, but unfortunately, that might have to be left for a separate video. What our goal here today is to finish off with these final 2 points, the 9th and 10th point in Ghamdi's counter-narrative. In the session before this, what we had done is we had gone and discussed some of the background with regard to the 9th point that we are going to get into. And part of that background was really looking at the idea that, simple idea that, look, up to this point, the first 8 points seem to be Ghamidi really taking to task the traditional narrative and having outcomes and conclusions that many proponents of secularism were in favor of. But once he gets to this 9th point, he reiterates something that he has said previously, which is that any counter-narrative that wishes to be successful in the Muslim society, any counter-narrative that wants to reshape how Muslims think about the relationship between religion and state, must come from religion, must be based on religious arguments, must be justified through religion. It cannot be secular. Secularism, he says, is simply something, an effort that is inevitably going to fail in Muslim society. Why is that? And we talked in last session, because partly proponents of secularism will try to suggest an analogy between what can happen in Muslim society and what happened and what already happened in Western society. But the reality was the relationship between Christian religion and the law of the Torah had been fractured, had been disassociated in a way that is simply not the case in Muslim society, and can frankly never be the case because of the positionality, because of the status that the Quran has in Muslim life, individual and collective life, and in the Muslim psyche. And as a result of that, divorcing or asking religion to be completely absent from any counter-narrative as it relates to religion and the state is simply not possible. So when he gets into the 9th point, what Ghamidi is saying is, if a Muslim government gets established somewhere, then oftentimes there's a demand that accompanies that. And that demand is that the Sharia should be implemented. Right? If a Muslim government gets established somewhere, that oftentimes it comes with an accompanying demand that Sharia should be implemented. And you see this in various places where Muslim governments or people on Muslim through that banner had come to the forefront. In Ghamdi's view, this framing of implementing Sharia is misleading. It's not that it's incorrect, the idea of a role for Sharia. It's not that it's incorrect to say that there's a role for Sharia there. It's just misleading to use this particular word and needs some adjustment because it's the wrong word to use. The reason is because it gives the impression, he says, that Islam has given the government a right to implement all the directives of the Sharia through the coercive power of the state. All the directives, right? But he says that's not the case. And in order to understand that, you have to understand that within the Sharia contains both religious directives that are addressed to individuals and those that are addressed to the collective. So when you say implement Sharia, that Sharia has to be implemented, then you are empowering the state to coerce individuals to follow individual directives as well. And he says this is problematic. This is not what the Sharia is empowering or the Quran or Sunnah advocate. This framing, he says, suggests, if you frame it like this, if Sharia must be implemented, meaning all directives of the Sharia, then what you are doing is, in this type of framing, you are basically saying that any Muslim government that arises must act in a way similar to how the three sort of most Muslim type governments or Muslim governments that exist are acting now, the theologically based governments. So Saudi, Iran, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. That is the method of Muslim governance, right? But here, the consequences of advocating for something like that, the consequences of saying that yes, a state will use its coercive powers to implement all directives of the Sharia, even the individual ones, we are seeing what is happening in these states and the type of relationship and aversion to religion that it's creating among individuals. Right? Ghamidi says that in actuality, no government has a right, according to the Quran and Sunnah, right? According to the Quran and Sunnah, no government has a right to implement directives that are addressed to the individual. So, he said, if we assume for a moment that religion requires me to wear a beard, and I don't, then in that case, I might be doing something wrong and I'm answerable only to God, not to the state. If the state does interfere, then they are in fact interfering in the relationship of the individual with God, and they have not been given this authority. The error, he says, of modern governments is the failure to distinguish between the two types of directives, the two types of law that are given in the Sharia. One that addresses the individual, the other that addresses society, the Muslim collective. The directives addressed to the individual are between the individual and God, Ghamidi says. And this is clear from the Quran. If you want to encourage people in this regard to obey these individual directives, you can do so by familiarizing themselves with God's command. And what you can do is you can counsel them, you can educate them, you can persuade them, but that is it. For example, a government, he says, cannot force an individual to fast, cannot force them to go on Hajj or Umrah, cannot force them to get circumcised, cannot force them to cut their mustache, etc. In the case of women, cannot force them to cover up the ornaments that they might be displaying on their chest or to wear a scarf when they go out. These are individual directives. It is simply not the case that what Islam proposes is that a list of directives, Sharia directives, are put before the government and then their police force, and that police force is sent out to enforce these directives. In these personal matters, no one has given the right to interfere in the lives of individuals, and this is according to the Quran and Sunnah. If someone proposes that they have been given the right to interfere, then they must bring that proof and show where they have been given that authority from. And in Ghamidi's view, there is nowhere that they can show that proof. It just does not exist. The only option that a government or even a religious scholar has in the case of individual directives, of directives to the individual, is that they can try to educate them, urge them, persuade them. The only exception, he says, is if there is a chance that somehow, in some way, by acting on an individual directive, I would somehow violate someone else's rights or transgress against someone else's life, wealth, or honor. Right? That's the only sort of scenario. The state is allowed to legislate when those two things happen. When someone's rights are being violated or someone's life, wealth, or honor are being transgressed against or violated. The Quran has explicitly stated, Ghamidi says, with regard to positive directives of religion, that means the directives that require you to act as opposed to refrain from something, that a Muslim government can only demand that people offer prayer, and pay zakat. Those are the only two individual directives that the Muslim government can intervene in, if they want. But it's not required. As it relates to zakat, it's not required. Zakat is on the one hand the right of God, but also the right of society. But a government could decide it doesn't need to take it, like in Saudi or the UAE, where there's no tax imposed, for instance. You have a right to relinquish this right to jihad as a government. If a government does impose zakat, it cannot impose any other tax, Ghamidi says, without the consent of the people. It can't do that. Beyond this, the Quran gives the state no right to ask for anything more with regard to individual directives. The other set of directives within the Sharia, within the law, are for the collective, and they are given to the government. Religious scholars can demand, with regard to those directives pertaining to the collective, they can demand from those in authority that they obey these directives. Not only can they demand this, not only should they do this, but Ghamidi says this is their duty. This is their sort of, in some respects, reason for existence. But what they can do is to demand simply that the Sharia be followed, not with regard to the idea of implementation. For those people who say that Muslim society should also ignore these collective directives of their religion, these collective directives to the collective, this law of the collective that exists within the Sharia, those people who say that these laws should be ignored, they're fighting a lost battle, according to Ghamidi. Intellectually, he says secularism has been defeated in the Muslim world, right? The fear that if we cede space to religion in the state, then we'll have to continue to cede more and more, and we're going to have these massive theocracies. He says, if we follow Islam correctly, this is just not the case, because Islam has demarcated the areas where the state can interfere. It's put limits, it's put boundaries the state cannot exceed. Government cannot interfere in personal lives. For instance, Ghamidi says for a long time he's been saying that the Saudi government has no right to demand a woman, for instance, bring a mahram to accompany her for Umrah Hajj. That it's up to the woman. That the advice that the Prophet gave to a woman with regard to this, it's up to a woman today to determine how that applies to her individual life. It's not a state matter. It's not for a government to decide, for instance, on a religious basis, whether women should drive or not. He says this is a completely baseless idea from the standpoint of religion. Right? If you're going to make that argument, you'd have to make it somehow in some illogical way outside of religion. So what Ghamidi is essentially saying is that secularism and Islamism, both of them are going to lose. Both, he thinks, will be defeated, and he thinks that eventually Muslim society is going to mature to a form where this defeat will be completely evident and they'll be at a different place. And he thinks that place is where what he is outlining here in the counter narrative, which he believes to be a true understanding of this relationship between religion and the state in Islam. Now, he says, and with regard to the directives that the rulers are supposed to follow, and we're going to talk about directives relating to society in a little more detail, but he says, look, they're really basically four, right? In the space of jihad, right? That rulers have to have there's some directives to follow in the space of zakat, and we see that with the Rida Wars and Abu Bakr, etc. The punishment for some crimes that are committed by those people who are in a covenant with God, in other words, by Muslims, right? That there are certain special laws as it pertains to certain behavior that is categorized as criminal but is done by Muslims that is problematic. And then Jummah prayer, for instance, right? There's directives relating to society, right? And he goes through them. And he's elaborated on them in other places, but here he's just going through them. He says, first, Muslims are not subjects of their rulers, but equal citizens. You cannot discriminate, he says, between Muslims in terms of the types of rights you're going to give them based on who they are and whether they're this race or that race, whether they're educated or not educated or wealthy or not wealthy. You can't do that. You cannot discriminate on that. All of the citizens, they all have a sacred status for their life, for their wealth, and their honor. You cannot impose, as we've noted, a tax on them after the zakat without their consent. If a dispute arises with regard to some personal matters of theirs, marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc., then and as a result, in those cases, there's some issue where someone feels as though their rights are being violated. And as we talked about earlier, in those cases where rights are being violated or there's a transgression against life, wealth, or honor, then the state can intervene to try to settle the dispute. And the government can do that here on these personal matters as well. The government is responsible for essential facilities, providing essential facilities for daily prayers, for fasting, for Hajj, Umrah, etc. And no individual can be forced to submit to any positive directive in Islam, anything that Islam is requiring of them, except in the case of prayer and zakat. All of this should be done with the spirit of consultation and fairness. Public assets and the public treasury are for public needs, for the welfare of the people. Right? The state is responsible, a second point, for organizing Friday and Eid prayers. And these prayers will only be performed where the government has set them up. Nowhere else. No one can independently set these prayers up. The pulpit is specific to rulers or their representatives. Right? That this is a directive, a religious directive that is given to those individuals who are responsible for Muslim collective life. Right? That they have to establish the Friday prayers. They have to have either themselves, preferably, or a representative on the pulpit speaking to the people. Third point, law enforcing departments like the army and the police are should be actually involved in the idea of sort of exhorting people to right things and forbidding them from wrong. Right? Exhorting people to right things, amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. Right? That is what it's not concerned with religious directives, really. This sort of the explanation of amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar that Ghamidi gives elsewhere speaks about the idea that this is related to moral virtues. These forces are involved in society to forbid things like corruption and bribery and indecency. Right? They work to stop all these things that all human beings really consider to be evil. The place where they can use force, aside from just exhorting people to stop this other behavior, the place where they can use force are places where another person's rights are violated or their life, wealth, or honor are transgressed against. That's the only place they can use force. Even in the other areas, it's exhortation that is going to be involved. The state must always adhere to justice, this is the next point, even with its enemies. There is no such thing as we're going to make this decision based on national interest. There's no such thing for Ghamidi. It is not a value like justice. The state is going to always uphold justice. These are the only principles for us. That is the underlying principle with regard to the Muslim collective and its interest. Its interest is in justice, not in some national interest. If a state, he says, the next point, if a state enters into an agreement, then they are bound by that agreement. They're bound to honor in letter and in spirit that agreement as long as it exists, because fulfilling pledges and contracts is critical within the Islamic faith. No treaties can be violated. As long as there's a treaty, it has to be obeyed, and there are numerous examples from the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where we see this. The final 2 points. Death penalty cannot be given except in cases of murder or spreading anarchy, disorder in the land. If a Muslim is guilty of murder, of theft, of fornication, of false accusation of fornication, and the court is satisfied that there should be no leniency based on personal, societal, familial circumstances, then punishment shall be meted out to him, the punishments articulated in the Quran. But these punishments that are articulated in the Quran are only for those people who have accepted the call of Islam. They're only for Muslims, because they are not punishment for some worldly objectives of deterrence, of rehabilitation, anything like that. What they are is divine punishment manifested in the world now. Punishment that will exist in the day of judgment that is now coming early. So you're not being punished for theft because you stole something and we want to deter you from stealing in the future. What you are being punished from is that you, by stealing in this way, you violated a covenant you have with God that you made when you became a Muslim. It is punishment for violation of that covenant. And finally, dissemination of Islam, the word of God worldwide, must be organized by the state. Right? The state has a responsibility to bring Islam, what it believes to be the truth, so to take the truth and bring it to different corners of the world. And if for some reason the spread is stopped or there are limits placed on it, or placed on the freedom to sort of spread the word, then the state must actively work to rectify that or even fight against that type of oppression. Right? That is the ninth point. The ninth point is that there are certain directives that exist, religious directives that exist, that apply to the collective, and that the individuals who are responsible for the Muslim collective are required to follow. That there is going to be a shade of religion with any Muslim government that comes into being. But there are parameters to it. There are outlines, there are borders that they have to stay within. And Ghamidi outline, and we've just discussed that in this point number 9. So then let me conclude with the 10th point, because it's brief. The 10th point that Ghamidi puts, the final point is addressed, he says, to the responsibility of the scholars. He says most of these points are addressed to scholars, right? Most of these 10 points. But here he's talking about this responsibility. The directives that he's outlined previously are ones that have to be followed. Rulers have to obey these, and scholars have to encourage them. If rulers are negligent of this or rebel against these directives, right, which we've seen in different countries, the only responsibility of religious scholars is to warn them of the consequences of this negligence, of this rebellion against these directives in this life, in this world, and the hereafter. And to do this through wisdom, through kind exhortation, through addressing their questions, through calling them to mend their ways. It could be that rulers don't understand everything. He says oftentimes it is that. So you have to be able to address their questions, and that is a responsibility of the scholars. You have to be involved in dispelling their doubts, give them reasoned arguments. You have to work for their hearts and minds, he says. This is the responsibility of the religious scholars. They are not there to be enforcing authorities. They are not there to be enforcing authorities at gunpoint to coerce people into the implementation of Sharia. That is not the role of the scholars. That is not their responsibility. And unless this is understood, then the scholars will delve into dimensions that are beyond their jurisdiction, that are beyond the scope of authority they have been given, the scope of responsibility that they have been given by the Quran and the Sunnah. Critically, the traditional narrative allows for this in a way that Ghamidi says in his counter-narrative is simply not part of the Islamic vision, as understood by the Quran and the Sunnah. So there you have it. There it is, 10 points that are part of Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's counter-narrative. We've tried to go into, in this discussion, I've tried to go into as much as possible some of the details that he articulates, that Ghamidi Sahib articulates in his discussion of the Dallas lectures, where he talks about the traditional narrative and the counter-narrative around religion and state. But there's much more to be said, much more to be read on this. And for those who are interested and are able to access Urdu language, I would encourage them to read some of Ghamidi's writings, to read Meezan, and to read the article he wrote on the counter-narrative. And in fact, I would encourage them, strongly encourage them, to read all the critiques of that article as well, because that type of exchange, that type of scholarly and intellectual engagement is necessary. To read what Ghamidi has written, read how people have argued against that, read how he has responded to that. And in that process of gaining knowledge from multiple sides, hopefully you develop your own thinking as well, and you deepen your understanding, not just of this discussion of narrative and counter-narrative, but of Islam and the faith of Islam and the law of Islam even further. That is my dua for all of you. I ask your forgiveness for any mistakes I may have made in this series of lectures. I ask forgiveness from you, I ask forgiveness from God, and if anything is of benefit, then it has come from God and God alone. وقولي قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المسلمين وآخر الدعوة والحمد لله رب العالمين.